In this first video, I'm going to take a look at the Airbus A320 provided by Aerosoft for FSX. This particular model is an extremely detailed model for FSX and has to be flown as per book. In fact, the manual that comes with this aircraft is 78 pages long, and it requires to be flown using the FMC and autopilot and cannot really be flown in any other way. I'm going to make a start by looking at the main control systems within the aircraft. Let's first have a general look at the layout of the 3D cockpit. The pilot and co-pilot instruments here very clearly laid out in front of us, with the autopilot panel to the top. The main throttle quadrant and engine instrumentations, and the flight control stick, much like a joystick, on both sides of the cockpit. Overhead panel with its many switches, and a panel behind the co-pilot with the main trip fuses for the aircraft. Ventilation controls, joystick control, and you can see the joystick instrument moving on the main display. Rudder pedals move with the rudder controls, and the trim wheels move with up and down trim. The throttle quadrant is notched. It has 3 positions and clicks into the positions rather than being a continuous graduated increase. Reverse thrust operated by pulling the levers up and replaced to idle. Looking at the instruments in more detail, each of the displays shows many features, and we will take a look at these more closely shortly. The multifunction display screens display all sorts of information for the pilot to assist with the operation of the aircraft. And everything is duplicated, of course, on both sides of the aircraft. The main autopilot panel contains all the various information that is required to fly the aircraft, and the various buttons and switches are operated using the left hand click, a right hand click, or the mouse wheel. There are 2 FMCs on board. We will look at those in detail later. In the top left hand area of the windscreen is a small button which, when clicked, opens up this extra panel view. By clicking on each of the illustrations, you can then jump to a predetermined view of various panels and parts of the instrumentation in the cockpit. This is a very useful way of getting very quickly to what you require. It also has a feature that when you get to the last little thumbnail in the top of the screen, if you use the scroll wheel on the mouse, a second set of illustrations opens up, and that gives you access to even more views. These views are very similar in nature to a 2D view and can make reading of the instruments and switches a lot more simple. And we will make use of these as we look in further detail at the various features of the aircraft. Clicking the little arrows at either end gets rid of the panel. The primary flight display shows all sorts of information. Speed indicator, attitude indicator, lateral and vertical ILS glide, altitude indicator, vertical speed, identification of the ILS, heading and track indicator, and air pressure. The navigation display shows your speed as ground speed and true airspeed, wind, direction and speed, the next waypoint, and the degrees and distance and time of arrival if and when a flight plan is input into that instrument, the lateral flight path, and the time. In the center of the console is the main engine display showing the engine parameters and temperatures, oil pressure, etc., the engine exhaust gas temperature, and below that the hydraulics panel showing you the status of the hydraulics of all of the main systems within the aircraft. The autopilot has to be used in conjunction with the FMC under normal conditions, though it can be used on its own in an emergency. The various switches and buttons operate by using the left or right mouse button or the scroll wheel. Left generally pushes the button in, right normally pulls the button out, and the scroll wheel will turn the switch left or right. You can see here that various displays will change depending on which button is operated. The autopilot has two basic functions, one which is manual setting, the other one which is an automatic setting. You'll see that there are little yellow dots. If the yellow dot is visible, it is being managed by the FMC. If the speed or altitude is visible, then it is being managed more or less manually by the pilot who is operating the autopilot. So it is left button, right button and scroll wheel to operate each and every button or switch on the entire panel. Here you can see the rate of climb or descent, the altitude being changed. Now the heading and now the speed. The other buttons on the panel are operated with a left click or right click, but not all of these buttons are available for use until the aircraft is actually in flight. So for some of them to function, the aircraft has to be airborne and in flight mode. Airbus have devised the system so that only when there is a fault is there an illuminated switch or button or light. No lights mean everything is okay. But on the overhead panel, again, the left mouse button or right mouse button or scroll wheel can be used to operate if necessary. But the basic principle is no lights, everything's okay. A light is a warning and requires something to be done about it.
Bravo. No.
On the central pedestal, the radio panels can be operated again with left, right mouse and scroll wheel on certain of the rotating knobs. So here the radio can be adjusted for the frequency required and then made active by clicking the little green arrow that you can see at the top of the screen. And the radio can be selected for whichever function is required. The cockpit illumination is selected by the two lower buttons, floodlight and integrated light. Left clicking and right clicking will switch on and switch off. The throttle levers are operated by pressing into click stops. We will look at these in detail later, but there is climb position, an FSX position, reverse thrust position, and they will make a definite click as they lock into each of these positions. Flicking the levers up gives you reverse thrust and then back to idle, and the flick levers go down. The trim wheels can be set manually if required, but under normal circumstances the FMC will control the trim of the aircraft automatically. On the Airbus, flaps are not set as degrees of flaps, but simply flaps 1, flaps 2 or flaps 3. There's a definite click as the flaps lever locks into position. The speed brake can be set in full or in part as required depending on the flight parameters at the time. So it could be a quarter or half or 3/4 or full. This is reverse thrust being set once again. The flick levers pulled up, the throttle levers fully back, and then back to idle.